Happy Mother's Day to you all. It's a blessing on this day to hear from one of our mothers of our congregation about the chance to guide the spiritual lives of our young people. It's a blessing to hear the gratitude of one of the souls this congregation helped and nurtured in her journey over these past few months or a year. It's a blessing to speak together the words of the mother of early childhood faith formation, Sophia Lyon-Foss, who reminds us of the miracle that every child of this earth is to each one of us. And it is a blessing to welcome our guest from Laundry Love this month to help us connect more fully with the ministry this congregation is supporting. Indeed, it's a happy day. It is a blessed day. And today we continue to explore the blessing that a covenant can be and how covenants are part of our community and our lives. We looked together a little last week at how a covenant or a promise begins, the signs that we see around us, the signs we make ourselves, the offers we make to others, and all our ways we begin to enter into covenants to make these promises to one another. And this morning we look at another aspect of covenants. We look at the ways that the promises we make shape the lives around us. You might remember my chanting last week, deeds not creeds, deeds not creeds. It's a chant of our early Unitarian ancestors who believed more in walking the walk than just talking the talk. But this chant didn't rise up from nowhere. It came from centuries of lessons, learned perhaps more by failures of our ancestors than by any virtue they may have inherited. Which is odd because normally people who are all talk lead such happy and successful lives, right? Well, if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. Now, that little turn of phrase comes to us from a time when many newcomers were arriving in New York City at the latter part of the 19th century. The place was booming, New York City, and a lot of people were out to make a buck. But some people were out to take a buck. And the man who made this phrase famous was George C. Parker. Parker is among the most notorious confidence men or con men in modern history. He was famous for taking people or for talking people into buying the Brooklyn Bridge from him. And he sold that bridge a lot. He convinced new arrivals to New York that he had the right to sell it, and sadly, but with the gift of some years now, somewhat comically, some of those poor purchasers only learned that Parker was all talk when the police arrived on the scene to halt construction of their own personal toll booths that they were building on either end of the Brooklyn Bridge. But Parker had a lot more than just the Brooklyn Bridge to sell, guys. He sold the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He sold Grant's tomb. He sold the Statue of Liberty. And he even sold Madison Square Garden a few times. Now, I know this might sound ridiculous, even for a new arrival. I mean, who would believe this guy, right? I mean, it sounds crazy, but Parker took being all talk to an art form. He didn't just buttonhole some unsophisticated rubes. No. He went all the way. He had official-looking permits, forged deeds. He had false identification. He even had costumes. To sell Grant's tomb, he impersonated Ulysses S. Grant's grandson. He made every sign that a buyer could ever think of that would tell them he was for real. But then, no action could follow. No deed could be effective. No performance on what was actually signed could ever be made. The covenants might have been signed, but they couldn't be sealed because we need actions for that. Now, just a short distance from the Brooklyn Bridge, a little south of Madison Square Garden, a few decades before Parker would get to ply his trade, another very special action did take place. 2 centuries ago, to the date, this coming Memorial Day, May 27th, Julia Rush Cutler gave birth to her May baby and named her little one Julia Ward Howe. Now, it would not be stretching the truth in any way to explain that Howe's family was a family of means and of high social standing. But Howe's head start in social standing could never fully account for the sheer tonnage of what she accomplished in a lifetime, the deeds she undertook, the promises that she fulfilled. Here are just a few. She wrote the words for the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That's the one that starts, "Mine eyes have seen the glory," and ends with, "His truth is marching on." Now, it doesn't quite sound like it, but that song was wildly popular in its time. So, really, Howe was a pop star in her day. And in addition to being her day's Beyoncé, she wrote volumes of literary thought and criticism that stand today as highly influential and insightful contributions in academic circles. So she was a scholar, a pop star, a scholar, and she kept writing and kept working, and in 1908, she was the first woman inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So she was also a boss. And she wrote this: "Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil and the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of counsel. She could write. I should just keep reading the rest of it. Finish with that. Oh, see? She's here. This was a portion of her work, Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. Some call it today the Mother's Day Proclamation. It was a call for an international meeting of women to end war forever. She called it the Mother's Day for Peace. But Howe's remembrance of this day sadly did not catch on in the way she hoped. She sponsored the holiday for a decade or so in the Boston area, but then stopped. It would be 3 decades later when President Woodrow Wilson would make Mother's Day a national holiday to remember mothers of the nation, but not to end the wars of the world. How often Howe's valiant attempt along with more than a dozen other women's attempts to advance the cause of peace, of life on this day, went unheeded and often goes unremembered. Oh yes, and incidentally, Julia Ward Howe was an avowed Unitarian. Yeah. And when I say she was avowed, I mean that she signed the book at Channing Memorial Church in Newport, Rhode Island, where you can visit today and see the brass plate on the pew where she sat Sunday mornings, just like so many of us are doing right now. She preached from Unitarian pulpits because Unitarians let women preach about a century before the next people, anyway, just like the one I'm standing at right now. She arrived at a Unitarian church after fades of creeds, fades that she determined might be all talk, that failed to live up to their promises, didn't work for her anymore. She arrived home, here, safely, to a place that nurtured and protected her, just like a lot of us here. I doubt very much whether any person has to think very far back or all too deeply in their memory to feel the difference between a promise made then broken and a promise made then kept. You don't need a contracts class to tell you the difference. Even right here in this place, some of my best intentions fall short of our aims at times. Even last week, my own carelessness caused hurt to some of those gathered here. In my sermon last week, I invoked the name of the Hawaiian god of the Makahiki. But later it was very graciously explained to me that this is not the time of the Makahiki. And that in the Hawaiian faith, invoking and using the name of the god of the Makahiki in the season when his presence is not now among us is simply not done. It was inappropriate. And for my carelessness and the impact it had, I do apologize. And I will try to be more thoughtful about my actions in the future. And in a few sentences of my sermon last week, I referred to the same God in the past tense, as in he descended or he arrived. This way of speaking discounts and diminishes a faith that is lived, that is real, that is present and beautiful, that glows in the lives of many of us here, many of our siblings that we love so dearly. And for my carelessness and the impact it had, I do apologize. And I will try to be more thoughtful about my actions in the future. See, in any relationship we want to last very long, it's essential to acknowledge when we have fallen short and to try to set things right. And on this day, this Mother's Day, it is right and beautiful to celebrate all the ways that the divine and cherished gifts of motherhood do blossom in so many of our lives. But it is also right to acknowledge that this day holds, for some, a singular tenderness, deep seeds, perhaps, of disappointment or longing, sealed tight inside. And I deeply admire the writing and the beauty of Julia Ward Howe's proclamation to all of womanhood, and yes, to mothers too, but I have to ask sometimes, is it fair to add to the list of what is expected, what is asked, what often is demanded, whether explicitly or implicitly by mothers of all kinds, of every turn, is it fair to add ending war and violence to that list too? I hear only mothers laughing. I mean, the level of perfection expected of motherhood, mothering, and mothers from so many corners of our families, our culture, even our religions, borders on the surreal, if not the downright impossible. After all, one of the most populous religions on earth chose the defining characteristic of its ideal of motherhood as virginity. Talk about expecting the impossible. And yes, some people who mother children do inflict overt and intentional harm on those lives, making it impossible for some to fully recover from that pain. But many more wonder silently whether they are living up to the impossible expectations this world has well enough. They fear the ways they might not be viewed if they don't. But a covenant, a human covenant, like motherhood, is not about accomplishing the impossible. It's about doing what might be hard. It's not about being perfect. It's about owning our mistakes. It's not even about keeping every single promise we make. But it is about mending those promises we break. At its heart, its core, the seed of a covenant is a relationship. And however the relationship eventually goes, for many of us, one of the earliest and most formative relationships we know is one with a mother figure. And the ideals of that relationship are spelled out, perhaps dictated by our cultures just about everywhere. And after all, that's why we call it Mother Earth, right? We don't call it Great Uncle Earth. I'm sure Great Uncle Earth would be fine at graduations and Thanksgiving, but we're not going to ask a ton of that guy, right? The love that some feel for their mothers can accomplish great things. In fact, it was because of his mother that Stevie Wonder sold out Madison Square Garden, luckily not sold by that fateful evening one November where I happened to be in attendance. And though yes, at that concert I got the chance to witness Prince play lead on Superstitious with Stevie, I know, just wait. There was another moment in that concert that will stay with me forever. Stevie paused after a number. He came to the front of the stage from behind his piano and explained into the microphone for the first time that night that the concert he was offering was in honor of his mother who had recently passed away. It was the first concert he'd given since her passing. And when he said that, he said his mother also had a favorite song. And that Stevie's version of that song was her second favorite version in the world. And when he started to say whose version was his mother's favorite, Madison Square Garden erupted. Maybe louder than when Prince paraded on in stacked heels and crushed purple velvet. Because the unmistakable silver curls set atop one of the kindest, smiling faces you could imagine stepped forward wearing a flawless tuxedo and took the stage alongside Stevie. And that's when Stevie announced it was always Tony Bennett's version of For Once in My Life, that's Stevie's mother's favorite. And together, Stevie Wonder sang with Tony Bennett Stevie's mother's version of that song. For once in my life, I had someone who needs me. These two gave life to the same song, the same words in two entirely different ways. Their interpretations of the words were different, but yet in that moment they were joined together, connected perhaps more for that difference than for what they shared. And so it was in 1908 when Julia Ward Howe made history again by accepting the recognition of the Academy of Arts and Letters, the culmination and fulfillment of a life dedicated to the abolition of slavery, to the forming of women's suffrage, to academic pursuits, the beautification of the world through poetry that rocked the pop world like Beyoncé. That same year, in 1908, right across town, in Brooklyn, George Parker, the all-talk extraordinaire, was arrested. In his life dedicated to false promises and unmet expectations met the beginning of its end. A justice in that year one might only describe as poetic. Whether by blood, by tears, by circumstance, or by fate, we are all, each of us, in relationship with one another. And we need each other to survive. For once in my life, I have someone who needs me. And that relationship must be held fast in the rich soil of this community, as our shared Mother Earth taught us to do so well. For there lies a seed that with the sun's love, in the spring becomes a rose. For this place, our community, calls us into covenant of deeds, not creeds, of promise making when there has been promise breaking, of oath keeping when for too long mere words have lay sleeping. In this place, our community will not soon forget one of the greatest mothers who calls out still to her children to remember not the idleness of talk nor the slumber of creeds unbelieved. She calls us to sing out again at last, glory, glory, hallelujah. Her truth is marching on. And may it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.
Amen.